In this video, we're going to be building a to-do application with Go and React. What are we going to be using? We're going to use Go as our server. We're going to use Fibre as our web server. We're going to use Vite to bootstrap our client. And we're going to use Mantine or Mantine. I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but this is going to be our component library. If you know how to pronounce it, let me know in the comment section below. And of course, we're going to be using TypeScript for static types. So what we learn, you'll learn how to make a basic Go REST API. You'll learn how to make a to-do application UI. You'll learn how to use React with TypeScript. And you'll learn some basic Mantine usage. So this is a demonstration of the application that we're going to be building. So you can see that I have two to-dos here already. I can add a new to-do and we get this nice modal here thanks to Mantine. So I can make a to-do to publish video and I'll add a body of upload video to YouTube. And I'll make another to-do here, sell to-do app of Sid sell to-do app for $1 million. And when we create this to-do, you can see that we send a post request here with our body and title. And then we get back all of our to-dos. So if I clear this out, we can mark a to-do as done by simply clicking it. And you can see that we send a patch request here. And we're going to send the ID inside of the URL. And then we're going to get back our to-dos. And we're going to have a done flag on the to-do that we clicked. So we can see done is true on edit video. So let's get started building this to-do application. So I'm in my projects directory here and I'm going to make a new directory called to-do application. I'm going to cd into to-do application. And I'm going to open this up in a new VS Code window with code. Inside of my new project here, I'm going to create a folder and I'm going to call this folder server. And the server is going to house our Golang application. So if you look in the description below, you'll see a link to the repository for this application. And inside of that repository, you're going to see this notes markdown file. And in here, we're going to have some commands. So this is the Go mod init, and this is the command to initialize your Go application. If you're used to Node.js, this would be something like yarn init or npm init. So I'm going to come into my server directory and I'm going to say go mod init github.com/tomdoestech/go react application. So this string here, github.com/tomdoestech/go react application, this is just a namespace for your application. You should replace the tomdoestech here with your GitHub profile. But this string here can actually be anything you like. But it's good to namespace it with where you're going to be hosting the code. After you run that command, you're going to get this Go mod file here, and this is going to declare your module. And so you can see we have our namespace here, and then we're using Go version 1.17. Next, let's install Go Fibre. So I'm going to type go get -u github.com/gofibre/fibre, and we're going to be using version 2. So after Go Fibre has downloaded, we can now go bootstrap our client application. And I'm going to build out the server first, but I'm just going to have the client there ready to go. I'm going to cd back into the root of our application. And I'm going to use this command here, yarn create vite client. Yarn create vite client. And client here is going to be the name of the directory. So if you wanted to call yours UI or something, you would replace client here with UI. And then we're going to use the React TypeScript template. So you can see we have our client here ready to go. And I'm going to cd into the client directory and I'm going to install some dependencies. So we're going to use the Mantine hooks, Mantine core. We're going to use SWR for fetching our data. And we're going to use this octi icons React just for a couple of icons. Let's copy that command and paste that into our client directory's terminal. So now that we have everything set up, we can go ahead and build our web server. So inside of the server directory, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this main.go. And I'm going to say package main. And this is just letting Go know that this is going to create a package called main. Next, I'm going to create a func called main. And inside of this function, I'm just going to print hello world. So we know that our Go application is working. So I'm going to say fmt.print. And I'm just going to print hello world. Let's cd back into the server directory. And to run our server, we can type go run main.go. And you can see we get hello world back. So we can start building our web server now. So I'm going to say app is equal to fiber.new. And you can see that VS Code has imported Fibre here for us. However, we want to use Fibre version 2, so I'm just going to add a v2 onto the end here. So you may be wondering what this weird symbol is here. So what we're doing here is we're creating a variable called app, and we're going to assign that variable to fiber.new. And then we're going to infer the type of app from whatever fiber.new returns. So if we were to use a simple equals sign, we would now need to define the type for app manually. But if we use this colon equals, it means we can infer the type from whatever new is going to return. You can command click onto this and you can see that this is going to return a pointer to an app instance. And so our app is going to be of type this app struct. As always, we're going to create a health check endpoint to make sure our application is up and running. So I'm going to say app.get. And then I'm going to define the endpoint here. So I'm going to say /health check. And in Go, we need to use double quotes. I'm going to fix this here. Then I'm going to provide a callback function. So I'm going to say func. And we've got a little bit of help here from VS Code, but we have a variable called C, and this is going to be of type Fibre context. So now we can return c.sendString, and I'm just going to send the string OK. So if we get back a 200 OK, this means that our application is up and running. And I'm just going to fix this health check here. This error here is saying that we could also return an error. So you can see here context.sendString can also return an error. And because we're returning this, we can also return an error from this app.get function. So I'm going to say app.listen, and I'm going to listen on port 4000. In Golang, you need to provide the colon. So I'm going to say colon port 4000. And I'm going to wrap this in a log.fatal. So if our app.listen method throws an error, it's going to call log.fatal. Let's run this with go run main.go. And you can see here that our application has started and we're listening on port 4000. So let's go have a look at our health check endpoint and make sure our application is up. So inside of Postman, I'm going to make a new request to HTTP localhost port 4000 /health check. And we get back an OK and a status code of 200. So our application is up and running and responding to requests. So the first endpoint I'm going to create is one to create a new to-do. But to do this, we need a struct to house our to-dos. So I'm going to say type to-do struct, and I'm going to have an ID. This is going to be an integer, and in JSON, I'm just going to call it ID, all lowercase. So I'm going to say JSON ID, and copy this down 4 times so I can just replace the strings here. Next, we're going to have a title. This is going to be a string, and then in JSON, it's just going to be an all lowercase title. I'm going to have a done boolean, and in JSON, this is just going to be done. Finally, I'm going to have a body, and you guessed it, in JSON, this is just going to be body all lowercase. So I'm not going to use a database or anything. I'm just going to house the to-dos in memory, just to make this Go server as simple as possible. So under where we create our server, I'm going to say to-dos equal to a slice of to-do. And now we can append to this slice and we can return it when we go to get all of our to-dos. So let's create a post endpoint so we can create a new to-do. So I'm going to say app.post. And we're going to listen for this request on /API/to-dos. We're going to have a function, and I'm going to see if VS Code can infer this for us, and it can. So I'm going to say to-do equal to ampersand to-do. And then we're going to try pass our body into this to-do here that we've just created that is of type to-do. and we need a capital for to do. So I'm going to say context.body parser, and I'm going to pass in our to do. Body parser can throw an error. So we need to define a variable where we can catch our error, and then we need to test for the error. And if we find an error, we need to return that error. So this is a little bit different to how we would do this in JavaScript, but hopefully it makes sense. So I'm going to define a variable here called error. And again, we're going to infer the type from the error thrown from body parser. And then I'm going to say if error, then I'm going to say error is not equal to nil. So if our error is not equal to nil, then it is equal to something, and therefore we have an error. Then we can simply return our error. So next we need to add an ID to our to-do. And we want our ID to be equal to the length of to-dos plus 1. So I'm going to say to-do.id is equal to len to-dos plus 1. So we're going to get the length of to-dos, and then we're going to plus 1. So at the moment, we have no to-dos in our application, and so it's going to be 0 plus 1. So the first ID is going to be 1, and then we're going to increment from there. Next, I want to append our new to-do to our array of to-dos. So I'm going to say to-dos equal to append to-dos, and we're going to append star to-do. So this is appending a pointer to our to-do. Next, I want to return c.json because we want to return in JSON format, and I want to return the list of to-dos we have, or the slice of to-dos. Let's stop our application and try run it again. So I'm going to come over to Postman, and I have this request here where I can post to localhost 4000/API/to-dos. We have a title and we have a body. What we're expecting to happen is we post our new to-do here, and then we get back an array with our to-do, and it should have an ID of 1. Send this request, and we have one error here. Cannot marshal type number into Go struct field to-do.body of type int. So I think what we've done here is we've done the body as an integer, but our body should be a string. So this is one of the good things about Go, is that it's going to type check everything for you out of the box. Send this request again, and we get back a to-do with an ID of 1, a title of testing, a done of false, and a body of finished tutorial. Okay, so our next endpoint should update our to-do so we can mark it as done true. So I'm going to make this a patch request. So I'm going to say app.patch /API/to-dos. And I want to get the ID out of the URL. So I'm going to say slash, and I'm going to do a full colon ID. And this is going to be a URL parameter. And then this endpoint is going to be /done. Then we're going to use the same callback here. So I'm going to say func and get VS Code to infer it for me. So the first thing we need to do is get the ID out of the URL as an integer. So I'm going to say ID or error is going to be equal to c.params_int, and then I'm going to get the parameter ID. So next we can say if error is not equal to nil, then we have an error and we need to return that error back out to the client. So I'm going to return c.status, and I'm going to return a status of 401, and I'm going to then send a string of invalid ID. To update a single to-do, we're going to need to loop through all of our to-dos. And then when we find the to-do with the ID that we're looking for from the URL, then we're going to mark its status as true, or the done field as true. Let's say for I and T is equal to range to-dos. So I here is our index, and then T is our to-do. I'm going to say if t.id is equal to ID, then we simply want to say to-dos I.done equals true. And then we can break out of our for loop here with break. And then after our for loop, we just want to return all of our to-dos back to the client. So I'm going to return c.json, and I'm going to return to-dos. Stop our server, and let's go try this endpoint. So I'm going to send a patch request here to /APIs/todos, and I'm going to call this with the ID of 1, and then of course the done parameter on the end here. So we don't get back any to-dos, and the reason we don't get back any is because whenever we shut down our server and start it again, we lose all of our to-dos because we're just storing them in the application's memory. Let's create a couple here. And let's send this. And you can see that the to-do with the ID of 1 is now true. Let's send this for to-do number 2. And we get back to-do number 2 is now true. So the next endpoint we want to make is a simple GET request to return all of our to-dos. So I'm going to say app.get /API/todos. And then in this endpoint's callback, I just want to return c.json, and I want to return the to-dos. Stop our server again, run it. Let's create a bunch of to-dos. And we can call this GET request here, and we're going to get back all of our to-dos. Okay, so this is our Go server done. Let's go start building the client for this to-do application. So I'm going to do all of the work inside of our app.tsx file here. So first up, I'm just going to remove the body of the file here. I'm going to remove this state parameter, and I'm going to remove these imports that we're not using. So I'm simply going to return a box here, and box is going to come from Mantine core. And inside of the box, I'm just going to say hello world. Let's start this server. I'm going to cd into the client, and I'm going to run yarn dev. Let's go over to a browser. And if we look at localhost port 3000, we just get our hello world text here. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is fetch the data. So I'm going to use SWR to fetch the data. So I'm going to import use SWR from SWR. And with SWR, we need to create our own fetcher. So I'm going to say const fetcher is equal to function. And our function takes one parameter, and this is the URL, and our URL is going to be a string. Then we're going to return fetch URL.then. Then with the response, we're just going to call response.json and then execute that. I'm also going to define an endpoint constant here. So I'm going to say exports const endpoint equal to HTTP localhost port 4000. So with our endpoint, we can add this to our URL, so we don't need to use our endpoint every time we call our fetcher. So I'm going to use some query strings here, and then I'm going to say URL, and I'm going to say endpoint/URL, and then wrap our URL in query string tags as well. Okay, so let's fetch our initial data. So I'm going to say const object equals use SWR. And then the endpoint that we're going to call is going to be API/todos. And then we need to pass in our fetcher. So use SWR is going to return some data. And it's also going to return a mutate object that we can use to later update our state as we change our data. So let's JSON stringify our data here to the DOM so we can see that it's being fetched correctly. So if we go back over to our application, you can see that we have a couple of errors here in our network tab, and these errors are saying cause error. Let's have a look in the console, and we can see that we have no access control allow origin. So this is a cause issue that we can easily fix in Fibre. Let's go back into our server and our main.go. And just under our app, I'm going to say app.use pause.new, and we're going to execute that function with some config. So I'm going to say pause config, and this is just defining the type for our config. Then I'm going to say allow origins, and the origin that we're going to allow is going to be HTTP localhost port 3000. And then the allow headers is going to be origin, content, type, and accept. Stop our server, run it again. Let's go over to our application. We can clear out all these errors and refresh. And you can see we now get a response from the server and we get an empty array. So we don't have to use Postman anymore. Let's first make our component that it's going to allow us to add a to-do. So inside of the client, I'm going to make a new folder and I'm going to call this folder components. And inside of components folder, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be called add todo.tsx. The function add to-do. Then I'm going to export default add to-do. I'm going to define a state variable here. So const array equals use state. We need to import use state from React. This state variable is going to default to false, and this is going to be called open and set open. And this is going to control whether our add to do dialog is open or closed. Next, I'm going to create the form. So I'm going to say const form is equal to use form. And use form is going to come from Mantine hooks. So I'm going to import from Mantine hooks use form. And Mantine hooks has a lot of really cool hooks that you can use. If we have a look at the documentation, you can see that we have all of these really cool hooks that you can use just from this hooks package here. This is actually one of the most underrated component libraries in my opinion, and I'm probably going to use it from now on for all of my React projects. So useForm is going to take an object, and we're going to have an initial values property. We're going to have a title, it's going to be an empty string, and we're just going to have a body, which is going to be an empty string. Next, we want to return our component. So the component that we want to return is going to be a fragment. And then inside of the fragment, I want to return a modal. And modal is going to come from Mantine core. So I'm going to import from at Mantine core modal. I'm going to set opened is equal to open on close is going to be equal to a function that sets open to false. Then we're going to have a title here that says create to do. Okay, so we want to define our form inside of this modal, but I'm just going to add some text here, and then we're going to have a button that we can press that's going to set open to true. So under our modal, I'm going to say group, and this is going to come from Mantine core. I'm going to say position equals center. Then I'm going to have a button that says add to do. A button is going to be full width. It's going to have a margin bottom of 12. On click is going to be equal to a function. And the function is going to set open to true. And this is not MD, it's MB for margin bottom. We need to import group. VS Code didn't do that for me, so I'm going to import that from Mantine core. So we need to render our to-do to our app component. So under where we add our data, I'm just going to say add to-do. I'm going to import add to-do from, I've created my components folder outside of the source directory, which is a mistake. You need to create it inside of the source directory. Let's go have a look at this. You can see we get a big button here. I'm going to click it and we get our modal, and I'm going to close that. So what we need to do now is add our form to the modal here. So I'm going to create a HTML form element. I'm going to create a text input, and text input is going to come from Mantine core, and VS Code has imported that for me. Next, I want a text area. This is going to be for the body of our to-do. And lastly, I want a button, and a button is just going to say create to-do. A button's type is going to be submit. And then we want an onSubmit handler on our form. So I'm going to say onSubmit equal to form.onSubmit. And we want to pass a function in here. The function we're going to pass in is create to do, but we haven't defined this function yet. So let's just define it here, function create to do. And this is just going to mean that our onSubmit handler isn't undefined anymore. Okay, so our text input is going to be required. It's going to have a margin bottom of 12. It's going to have a label of to do. It's going to have a placeholder of what do you want to do. And we need to spread our form get input props onto our text input here. So I'm going to open up new object curly brackets, and I'm going to say spread form dot get input props. And the input props we want to get is title. Let's copy this down onto our text area, and we just need to change a few things. So our label is going to be body, and we're going to have a placeholder of tell me more. And our get input props is going to be body. Okay, so our form looks good so far. Let's go check it out. Yep, we have our to-do title and our body and our create to-do button. We just need to fill in our create to-do function here. So we're going to get some values, and the values that we're going to get is an object. We're going to get title string, and we're going to get body of a string. And we say const updated equals await fetch. And we need to get our endpoint. So I'm going to say endpoint, and VS Code's going to import this for me. We're using await, so this needs to be an async function. And the endpoint we're going to call is /API/todos. The method is going to be a post. We're going to set some headers. The header that we're going to set is content type. And we're going to set this to application/JSON. Next, we're going to set our body. And our body is going to be equal to json.stringify values. And because we're using fetch, we need to call .json. So on this, I'm going to call .then. I'm going to get the response, and I'm going to say response.json. Next, we want to say form.reset. And this is just going to reset our form back to the initial values. And then finally, we want to set open to false. So in our app.tsx, we defined this mutate value here that is returned from use SWR. And we want to pass that into our add to do. So I'm going to pass that in. And to get the type for our mutate function here, we can hover over mutate here, and you can see that it's keyed mutator and then any. So we can type this as keyed mutator, and we don't want to type it as any because we know better than that. So I want to create an interface for my to-do object. So I'm going to say export interface to do. ID is going to be a number. We're going to have a title, which is a string. We're going to have a body, which is a string. We're going to have a done property, which is a Boolean. So we can also type our to-dos from use SWR with to-do, and then it's going to return an array of to-dos. So inside of our keyed mutator, we can say to-do, and this is going to be an array. So to use mutate, we simply need to call it, and we can call it with our updated property, because updated is going to be a newly updated list of all of our to-dos. I have one little problem here. TypeScript isn't happy, and that is because I haven't named this property here. I need to name it, and now TypeScript is happy with our add to-do function, and it's happy when we use the component as well. Let's try this out now. So I'm going to put some dummy text in. I'm going to call create to do. We send a post request and we get our data up here as well. So the reason we get our data here is because when we call add to do, we're calling mutate with our newly updated list. And this is going to update the returned result of use SWR. So the next thing to do is to map through our to-dos. So I'm going to say data.map. And the reason I'm using a question mark here is because to-do couldn't be undefined while we're still fetching the data. I'm going to have a to-do property here, and I'm going to return a list.item. And actually outside of our map here, I want to define a list. I'm going to move the closing list down below our map. And our spacing is going to be extra small. Our size is going to equal to SM. Our margin bottom is going to be 12. And we're going to define this as center. So inside of our list item, I'm just going to say to-do.title. And I need to add a key, so I'm going to say key. And I'm going to add some templating strings here. I'm going to say to-do. And then I'm going to add the to-do.id. And the reason I add this to-do at the front of our ID here is because if we use to-do.id as a key in another place in our application, this is more likely to be unique because we can just prefix all of these keys with something here. So I could actually call this like to-do list and then our to-do ID. And this gives us a better chance of our key being unique throughout our application. Let's have a look at this. And you can see that we have our to-do up the top here. I'm just going to add a few styles to our box here, so our page is a little bit easier to see. So to add styles to Mantine, you can use props such as spacing that we've done here, MB, but you can also define your own styles with SX equals a object, and then we're going to provide a callback function. The theme will be available in here. You can use theme properties if you like. And then I'm going to say padding. So this needs to return the object. So I'm going to put some brackets here. I'm going to say padding to rem. Width is going to be 100%. Our max width is going to be 40 rem. And our margin is just going to be 0 and auto. And this puts our list in the middle here. So let's add some icons to our items. So inside of the list item, I'm going to say icon equal to, and then I want to say to-do.done. So I want a different icon for the to-dos that are done, as opposed to the to-dos that are still pending. So if our to-do is done, then I'm going to add one icon. Otherwise, I'm going to add a different icon. We can import from Mantine core theme icon. So I'm going to use the theme icon component. Then inside of that, I can use the check circle fill icon. And this icon here is going to come from this primer OctiIcons React. And this size is just going to be 20. On our theme icon, I can provide some colors. So I'm going to say color is equal to teal. The size here is going to be 24. And the radius is going to be XL. And 24 actually needs to be a number, not a string. So let's copy this and put this inside of our icon for when the to-do is not done. But I want to make the color gray. So I'm just going to use the same icon and I'm just going to make it green when the to-do is done. Let's have a look and we can see we have one to-do here that's not done. So let's add a function. So when we click a to-do, it marks it as done. So I'm going to say function mark to-do as done. And this is going to be an async function. I say const updated is equal to await fetch. And we're going to do the same thing that we did here, where we get our updated and then we call mutate to update our application state. So I'm going to fetch endpoint / API / to-dos / and we're going to get an ID here / done. The method is going to be patch. Then I'm going to call .then, get the response, and then call response.json. So we need to get our ID, and this is going to be a number. And lastly, we just need to call mutate and updated. So let's add an onClick handler on our list item. So I'm going to say onClick equal to a function, and our function is going to call mark to do as done. And we're going to get the to-do .id. So let's go try this out. I'm going to click this to do, and we get a 404 here. And I think this is because our endpoint should be /todos, not to do singular. Try to change this, and we'll try click it again. And you can see our to do check mark has turned green, and we've sent a request to our mark as done endpoint, and we get a response with all our to-dos back, and done is true. So that is a simple to-do application with a Golang backend and a Vite React frontend. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.